Buongiorno e benvenuti a tutte e a tutti al primo talk di ottobre 2022 per Archive Online Academy. Scusate per l'attesa, stavamo mettendo a posto qualche dettaglio tecnico, anche perché oggi ci saranno persone collegate su Zoom, ma anche in presenza. Chi ci sta seguendo da Zoom non ci vede o non ci vede interamente, ma sono qui con noi anche, c'è qua con noi anche un po' di pubblico. Il professor Jorge Otero-Pailos terrà oggi questo talk, Art as a Method of Experimental Preservation, e qui abbiamo la sua classe della Columbia University, perché il professore è direttore del corso Historic Preservation alla Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation della Columbia. Quindi qui con noi in questi giorni, per la settimana che abbiamo appena trascorsa, abbiamo avuto i suoi studenti per svolgere una summer school dedicata a questo genere di tematiche. Quindi oggi abbiamo la fortuna di avere un ospite d'eccezione che presenterà anche il suo ultimo volume, Historic Preservation Theory, an anthology from the 18th to the 21st century, because we are in the 21st century. Well, sorry, I was speaking in Italian because our users, the people following us are Italian as well. and so thank you everybody for being here. And well, most of you know what and who we are going to listen today. I wanted just to add that this talk, it's inside of a program that is called AOA, Archive Online Academy, this one. And well, it's from 2020. We started this adventure, this academy, online first, now blended in presence and online, and we usually discuss about well, mostly digital humanities topics, and of course topics and projects and studies that are related with Fondazione Cini or Venice or our partners or the people we admire. And so this is to give you some coordinates on the general program. I switch to Italian briefly and then I will leave the floor to the professor. Per gli studenti di Ca' Foscari che necessiteranno e che hanno fatto richiesta di ricevere i crediti formativi, è necessario per favore mandare all'inizio della lezione e alla fine un messaggio sulla chat di Zoom privata all'indirizzo di Fondazione Giorgio Cini, all'entrata e all'uscita con nome, cognome e l'orario. Effettivamente l'avevo anche scritto. Lo stesso vale nome, cognome e mail anche perché per coloro che desiderano ricevere un attestato di partecipazione. Per l'attestato di partecipazione vi preghiamo di farne specifica richiesta. Io non mi sono presentata, comunque ho introdotto il professore e vi porgerò le domande che potrete scrivere nella chat al professore. Sono Costanza Blaskovic e lavoro per Archive. Quindi anche per le domande potete scriverle nella chat o chiedere la parola. Lascio la parola definitivamente al professore.
Tutti gli studenti che sono online possono capire l'inglese? O c'è qualcuno che non parla inglese? Quante ci sono? Sì. Allora, qualcuno vuole dire Tutti parlano inglese? Mettete nel chat se c'è qualche problema con l'inglese. Tutti? Benissimo. We're gonna speak English. So they say they can speak English. They are folks online.
Yeah,
so first of all, Costanza, thank you for the wonderful introduction. I want to also take this opportunity to thank the Cini Foundation, the wonderful hosts, Renata Codello, Maria Novella, Chiara, Francesca. We really feel at home here. It's been a wonderful stay, and we are just delighted to have been invited to be here in this research collaboration on preservation and its entanglements with the climate change, social issues, political issues. So the students are here working on that. So I'm going to jump right in. Today's lecture really concerns, it's a 2-for-1, which we like to do. So I'm going to speak very briefly about this new book that just came out last week. And then I'm going to present you some of my own work. So to some of my students here, some of this stuff will be familiar and some of it will not be familiar. But since this is a small seminar setting, please, let's make it a discussion. Any questions, any thoughts? I'm going to start with a presentation. Maybe you can help me share screen if you wouldn't mind. Fortunately, this is on the right side, which is my good side. So this is. Okay, super. So historic preservation theory is an anthology that traces the thought that shaped the discipline that we now call historic preservation from essentially the Enlightenment until the present. Now, that, of course, in any anthology, this is for me, there's been about a decade worth of work, and it's been a decade worth of work that has been a lot of fun. So in a way, I'm kind of sad to publish this book because the work is really the pleasure of it. A lot of it has been with former students in class, discussing what is relevant and what is not, but also discussing the very issue of what is preservation. And of course, to begin to say preservation theory from the Enlightenment, what was preservation in the Enlightenment? Of course, is the same question than to say architecture theory since Vitruvius. What was architecture at the time of Vitruvius, right? So in every act of thinking about the various streams that lead to constitute a discipline in the way that we understand it today, there is a historical project that we enter into. And so we have to contend with questions of where to begin. Of course, there have been preservation thinking in every ancient civilization. There has been some kind of way of preserving the past. But one of the things that really I felt was very important is to begin to understand historic preservation in a moment in which we can see ourselves reflected. And in the Enlightenment, we can still see ourselves reflected. Many of the problems, the questions that were raised in the Enlightenment are questions that are still relevant to us today. So one of those questions in particular, I think, is very important and is one of the reasons why I begin the book with Winkelmann, a poor German son of a shoemaker who comes and is bright and goes through the ladder of society and begins to get appointments in different royal courts and princely courts until he becomes librarian to the Vatican. That's what we call meritocracy. So that's one thing, that the power of ideas gets you ahead. That's the principal thought of a kind of profession. But there is another one, and this is why I am so excited to present the book here in Venice. A very important figure called Carlo Fea, Venetian, who was, and you can see in the, how do I advance over here? In the introduction, this is, come on. Yeah. So a couple of people here. Of course, Carlo Fea of the 1830s, right? Legal briefs concerning antiquities and public establishments, dealing with the question of what happens when people like, say, the French come to Venice and take a bunch of stuff back to France, like the painting that is over here that we all are familiar with, the wedding at Cana. What do? Well, you know, we have to have some international law for restitution. So today we have a very robust debate about the restitution of works of art to different places where the colonial empires were. Some of those discussions began by legal scholars here in Venice. So it's very meaningful to me to be here in Venice to begin to present that book. Other people like Émeric de Vatel, who wrote a book called The Law of Nations, in which he said something very important, which was that if you go to war with somebody you don't like, you have a responsibility to preserve their heritage. That seems kind of strange. Aren't we the enemies? Don't we want to destroy their more, you know, we want to break their hearts, break their minds, conquer them, right? Said, no, you know, you only have a legal right to go to war with somebody else if they have a bad government. And that bad government needs to be replaced with a good government. And while you're at war, you have to respect their culture. That's a very important change in thinking that happens in the Enlightenment that we still see ourselves reflected in. When we go to war, we say, yeah, you can go to war, but it's really, you shouldn't be destroying the mosques, the churches, all of that. So very important moment, the Enlightenment for us to connect with and to see ourselves reflected in. So what is historic preservation really has this, it's really entangled with the project of enlightenment, but also is pushing on the project of enlightenment. Because the question, of course, is, was the Enlightenment European? Was the Enlightenment Western? What does Western mean? That is one of the questions that this book raises for us to think about. What is Western indeed? And so, you know, when we begin to read this book, you will see that it really begins to engage the notion of the Western and to decenter at the same time the notion of the Western as only a European project, but it really, the very idea of the Western is a global project from the get-go. You know, this is a moment of global, and one of the ideas of the Enlightenment. And I wanted to read to you Thomas Paine, which I took the pain to, forgive the pun, to quote in the book, because I think it's another idea that I think is very important for us today, that we see ourselves reflected in, So Thomas Paine, you all know, is a revolutionary. He was the major theoretician of the Revolutionary Wars in the United States and in other places. And he talks about this idea of who's the smartest of them all? Mirror, mirror on the wall. Who's the smartest of them all? Is it Europeans that are the smartest of them all? Does it have anything to do with the race that we happen to be born into? And he says, that's the past. That's the way people thought of in the past. In the Enlightenment, there is no such thing as you getting a credit for being born of any particular race. And he writes this, he writes, experience in all ages and in all countries. And that's very important. He says, in all ages, in all countries. He is a member of what we now call the natural rights tradition. The natural rights tradition, which means that nature is something we need to attend to in the way nature works. And he says, nature, in all ages and all countries, has demonstrated that it is impossible to control nature in her distribution of mental powers. So who's smart, who's dumb, you can't control. You can't control that by race, you can't control that by nation. She gives them as she pleases. Whatever is the rule by which she, apparently to us, scatters these gifts of intelligence among mankind, that rule remains secret to man. It would be as ridiculous to attempt to fix the hereditaryship of human beauty as of wisdom. So already he's saying, wait a minute, beauty is also not something that any one culture has a leg up on, that has a, you know, hegemony on, that has the monopoly on, but also intelligence. So he says, whatever wisdom constituently is, it is like a seedless plant. It may be reared when it appears, but it cannot be voluntarily reproduced. So you cannot try to breed intelligence. Doesn't matter how much you want to say, you know, let's have a pure race, let's have a pure whatever. You can't do that. That's not how intelligence works. There is always a sufficiency somewhere in the general mass of society for all purposes, but with respect to the part of society, it is continuously changing its place. It rises in one today and another tomorrow, and has most probably visited in rotation every family of earth, and again withdrawn. And we know this to be true. Every family has an idiot uncle and a very smart aunt, right? How can that be? Isn't your family supposed to be the greatest, or right? There's always one that happens to be a little bit smarter or better at this, better at that, right? And he says, this is how we should run the world. We should pick people to be at what they're good at. And if somebody's very good at running a country, let's make them king. We shouldn't be depending on the family of one monarchy to give us smart people to rule. That's crazy. We're going to get dumb kings. We have to come up with a different system of government based on this idea that we need to choose who's better for the job. That idea is one that we are still living with today, and is one that was central to historic preservation, because it began to open up the notion that wherever we go, there might be things worth preserving, there might be beauty, there might be historical value, and it's not just our culture. So immediately in the Enlightenment, we are caught up in the question of intercultural exchange, and we are caught up in these backs and forths. So the book really takes up this question also within the realm of disciplines. It is it's interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary volume, in the sense that the knowledge that was developed about historic preservation did not develop in a field called historic preservation, because that field didn't exist. That name didn't exist when we began the volume. It really evolved over time. So you're going to find lawyers in the anthology, like you have like Carlo Fea, like Émeric de Vattel, or like in the 1860s, Francis Lieber. Francis Lieber being a German lawyer that emigrated to the United States, fought for the Union Army, and wrote the code of the American Union Army. Part of it, he wrote, you cannot destroy the South's heritage. You cannot destroy the plantations. You cannot destroy all that. So that was a very important book. So anyway, you're going to find lawyers, you're going to find, of course, architects, you're going to find artists, you're going to find poets. That to me is very important, that poetry is a form of knowledge. And sometimes the kinds of things that we call historic preservation are not obvious to all. You're going to find fiction writers, Marcel Post. You all know Marcel Post for the Madeleine, but did you know Marcel Post was also a major theorist of preservation, who was working to protect the churches from the secularization, from what happened in France, which was, okay, we have all the churches, they are now belonging to the state. You know what? Get the priests out. And Marcel Post says, if you get the priest out, then that building has no meaning, because that building is a religious building that is about the exchange, the religious liturgy. All of the objects in there have meaning only if they're being used. And he talks about smell, of course, and he talks about the incense of the cathedrals being part of what gives them meaning and value. And so he's talking about something that we today call intangible heritage, before the word intangible heritage is there, right? And he is questioning the idea of a separation between tangible and intangible. He is fighting for a notion of heritage that is one that incorporates the body and incorporates the architecture. And people like Countee Cullen. Countee Cullen was one of the most important early 20th century poets of the United States, came out of the Harlem Renaissance, was an African-American, and wrote this really important poem called Heritage, in which he tries to define the notion of heritage through poetry. And he says, he starts the poem by saying, "What is Africa to me?" Right? He is somebody that is deeply Western in his education, in his upbringing, in his birth, but is also wondering about what is lost in the process of making heritage. And he says, you know, what is culture when much of the culture that you are told about doesn't exist? There is no physical evidence for it. It has been purposely taken out because you're living in a racist society, for example. That was his. So the body, the practices, the rituals become really important in his definition of heritage. So, some of these themes, I'm just picking out some themes that run through the book, right? Michel Trouillot, Caribbean thinker from Haiti, talking about the idea of the archive. What happens when an archive doesn't have the information that you thought should be there? That is a kind of silencing of the past. And what happens when the built archive, when the buildings that are there that are supposed to be telling us the story of heritage are demolished? Well, there is a missing piece, and that's a missing piece that we need to talk about. I don't know, what's this thing going back or forward? I think it's going back. Is it going back? Yeah. Oh, sorry, yeah. Sorry. So you're going to see some philosophers also about, for example, Hannah Arendt writing in mid-century about the durability of the world. How do things last, and how does an object in lasting allow us to transmit knowledge over time, and how to theorize that and how to think about that. And Jacques Derrida on the notion of the parergon, for example, where does the object end? What is the border of a monument? That's something that we think about constantly in heritage, because you actually have to draw a line around the monument and be like, this is the monument, this is not the monument. But of course, that line is a negotiation, and it is one that we must come to question, and that is one of the essays that will help you to do that. So these are essays that are beginning to open up a series of really important issues and ideas, like, for example, energy and sustainability. James Marston Fitch was the founder of the historic preservation program at Columbia, or, for example, the social value of historic buildings. Jane Jacobs, famous Canadian, who really cut her teeth in New York, or somebody like Dolores Hayden, arguing for the role of art as a form of preservation, which is what I'm going to talk about today, of course. There's a lot more to the book. I would encourage you to, go through the introduction. In the introduction, I try to take apart this notion of the name historic preservation. Why do we call it preservation? That's an American term. Nobody ever, here uses historic preservation. So already the title signals a kind of location of this work within the world of, American thinking. But it also really engages in that debate about what is this field that we don't have a name for. By the way, if you're an architect, what is architecture called in Brazil? Arquitetura. What is it called in Canada? What is it called in Israel? Yeah, that doesn't quite work. Architettura, yeah. So, here in Italy it's called architettura. It kind of sounds the same. right? It has the same root. It does have a kind of a, you know, this archy, right? Preservation has been called conservation, preservation, restoration. These are national ideas. These are what you will see in this anthology, is that these are constructions that have as much to do with ideas as with nation states. And so it opens that up and unpacks it and begins to help you think through that question of how do you call a discipline. It's very interesting. The preservation is a thing that we all agree upon, but we don't share a name across countries. And that's where, in a way, this book began, just with that very simple question to say, why not? Why don't we have the same name? And when I started digging, I realized that the theories of each country have been carefully guarded, and the previous anthologies were all national. They really look at their country, their series of thinkers. They're the best perfume. And the other countries are kind of mentioned, but not really engaged in. So there were no translations of very important texts, like, for example, Abbé Grégoire, famous revolutionary monk who secularizes the French state and begins the project of preservation in France. Everybody references this person, and it had not been translated into English. How can that be, right? What is lost? So this is there are many first translations into English. The hope here is that these will be doors for readers to explore further. There's almost 100 texts over here. They're short crystallizations of the thinking of each of these authors for you to go in deeper on your own. But each of the texts has an introduction that gives you the necessary context, the necessary political, social, intellectual context for you to understand why this person is included, and go from there. And hopefully what this will begin to do is to break down those national boundaries and begin to open up the relationship between all of these schools of thought. So for example, when we have a Liang Xisheng, who is one of the originators of preservation in China, he's Chinese, yet he's also incredibly Western, incredibly cosmopolitan, spent some of his life in Japan, was also trained in UPenn in the United States, is very much in dialogue with an international conversation. So you're going to see all of these different intersections play themselves through. I want to stop there because this is a 2-for-1. So this is the one. I'm going to go to the 2 with this nice segue. But what you'll find in the introduction is also some thoughts about what theory is. So we talked about why the 18th century to the present, why historic preservation as an idea, and why theory, and the different kinds of theories that are represented in this book, from poetry as theory to legal text as theory to more traditional kind of, scholarly theoretical works like Camilo Boito and others, some of whom also had not, Boito, who is so important, had also, the test text had not been translated into English before. So a lot of the Italian school of preservation, which is so important internationally, many of the foundational texts had not been translated into English. So maybe I'll just pause there before I switch over, but are there any questions or thoughts about it? Curiosities that you, things that are unclear that you want me to just quickly respond to? Yeah, Dana.
So when translation from one language to another language, how does different from the languages affect the translation and in relation to preservation?
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. So in the book, there are a number of footnotes that have been included by the translators. The translators are all in the back. So these are people that, have been more than just translators, they've been really advisors, friends, you know, that have participated in the book. And so, for example, Lucia Le, who's also on the faculty at Columbia, translated Abbé Grégoire, who I mentioned a little bit earlier. And there are subtleties of language, like what did he mean? So there will be an asterisk and a clarification at the bottom of the page, giving you the different meanings so that you make up your own mind. The same with many of the Italians, you know, for example, you know, Igor Demchenko, who's a former doctoral student of mine who translated some of the Russian texts in this. You know, by the way, is Russia part of the Western world? I mean, they extend all the way to Asia, right? Throughout history, Russia has been in and out of the Western world conceptually. But anyway, he provides some of that. Some of the German texts, of course, kind of unimaginably, people like von Klenze, who restored the Acropolis, had never been translated into English. You know, his thoughts on restoration. People like Dehio, who is a major, you know, thinker of what does it mean to be modern through preservation, had never been translated. So you're going to see it in the terms change, what they mean. And so all of that is in the footnotes. But since we're here, you know, some of the other texts like Giovannoni, never been translated into English. How can that be? Giovannoni, the theory of pruning, who laid the groundwork for how we understand the development of historic centers. We wouldn't really, you know, because how do you modernize a historic center? It was, of course, thinking about Rome. How do you enlarge streets when you can't really enlarge streets to put a tram through or a bus, a medieval town? The whole street widening of the early 20th century process would not be understandable from a preservation point of view without this man. Never been translated into English. And so what he meant by, what does diridamento mean in English? You know, does it mean thinning of the tree? Does it mean pruning of the fruit? What does it mean? It is a kind of horticultural reference in thinking of a city as a living tree. So there's a lot of complexity. Dana, thank you for that question. That's a really important one, and one that, of course, can never be fully answered, but it certainly is addressed in the book. Other thoughts or questions?
I'm curious
yes.
what your process was for how you selected what made the volume. Because I assume you probably read or encountered 3 times as many texts that you chose somehow to not include.
Yes, this was the hardest thing. This is why it's kind of sad to me to finish the project, and why I say I am not done, right? And why I would say right away, there is a companion website, which is under construction. And so there's a QR code. The last page is a QR code. And in that QR code, there is an invitation to scholars around the world to do the research in their home countries, to do the translations into, for better or for worse, the international language of business. Not my first language. I had to learn English as a second language. Many of us have to learn English as a second language, but it is the instrument that we have to. It used to be Latin, then there used to be French. Now it's English. So be it. Who cares, right? The point is to communicate. So there is a companion website in which there is a form for people to submit important thinkers that they're familiar with, that they think other people should be aware of in the reference. And also schools of thought, because, you know, I don't think you can understand Angkor Wat without understanding the Italian School of Restoration, because the Italian School of Restoration was heavily involved in Angkor Wat. But so was the French, and the Italians got a temple, and the French got a temple, and the Germans got a temple, and they were trying to outdo each other in terms of preservation in Angkor Wat. So, you know, but do we have a text from Angkor Wat? No. That for me is, you know, a missing piece that I would, you know, but so to your point, Skylar, the limits of my linguistic abilities, the languages that I speak are minuscule compared to the languages that exist. So already there is a huge limitation there. How do I get around it? Talk to other people. That's what I tried to do. I talked to Chinese scholars. I tried to talk to African scholars. I tried to talk to scholars in different countries and said, please help me. You know, what do you recommend? And they recommend something, and then we try to work on it. You know, it's then you have to find the money to get the text translated. Then you have to find the time. So it takes forever, but so it's a process, I would say. As I went through the process, it became clear to me that certain people that I thought were very important were actually derivative of other people, that they had not really made the right, that they were not the ones that were responsible for the intellectual innovations. And so I went ahead and took those out and put in the people. The other thing I didn't do, which I think is also very important to mention, is I didn't include what is called theory within historic preservation. What? Isn't this the title of the book, Historic Preservation Theory? That, to me, is not theory, because when you pick up a book that is called Preservation Theory, what you get are the conventions and charters, the how-to, the what to do, the rules and regulations. The Venice Charter is not in this book. The Bura Charter is not in this book. All of these conventions are not, but for example, if you think about the Hague Convention, which is incredibly important for the development of preservation theory, because it's the one that says if you go to war, you can't destroy the enemy's heritage. Hague Convention, 20th century. It's derivative of Émeric de Vattel. It's derivative of Carlo Fea. It's derivative of Francis Lieber. In fact, it kind of really, Francis Lieber is the most important. But you wouldn't have Francis Lieber without Émeric de Vattel. So there are lineages in there that lead to these conventions. I mentioned that in the because those things that we call preservation theory today are really fossilized, out of date by the time they're published, rules and regulations that are sapping what they can out of the intellectual advances made sometimes decades, sometimes centuries earlier. They come late to the game. And they are dogmatic. And so in preservation, oftentimes you will hear people say the dogmatic charters, and they'll use that interchangeably with theory. Theory is not a dogma. If theory gets fossilized into dogma, it is no longer theory, because theory is a form of questioning. So dogma is by the definition of dogma is what you cannot question. So if we have a discipline organized around text that you cannot question, we don't have a discipline. That's why this book does not publish what is so-called theory, and it is actually questioning the idea that that's theory. But I mentioned that in the introduction. But that was a tough, you know, because people will say, hey, whoa, where's the Venice Charter? You know, where are the, well, you know, that's why. Yeah, Francesca.
I would like to thank you for these enormous efforts, because this is a great opportunity to compare theory and ideas through the ages, but also through the nation and through different mindsets. So it's really, really a useful book for everyone, because we have the opportunity to go inside passing the problem of the language and of the translation, and just a book, we can collect many books. So thank you very much for what you did.
Yeah, thank you, Francesca. Well, you know, it's just, as I said, it's just a start. It's a labor of love, but it's really, you know, an attempt to light a flame and to keep a flame alive, you know. I had a really great time. I hope others will have a great time as well. To do this kind of research, you know, to think, and really as a way for, it's really meant for students. I mean, this was, you know, I really meant it for you guys. And I end the introduction with a note to students to say, hey, you know, you got a brain, you got an amazing brain, use it, because we need thinkers in historic preservation. And we don't, and the people that wrote these things were probably not as smart as you are. They just spent the time, you know? So all it takes is putting in the hours. So that's, you know, it's hopefully an idea that just after dinner, you know, write a few sentences and get going. Yeah, Scott.
So as this lands in the hands of students and practitioners of preservation, I'm wondering what your hope is for the future of this, specifically this book and this volume, this collection of essays. Is this something that gets added to by future authors, future thinkers? Is it something that we even begin to question these terms, conservation, restoration, preservation, maybe adding new terms like maintenance and putting those kinds of thinkers into the anthology?
Yeah. Well, there is an author here that I think might be of interest, Mirle Ukelis, Mirle Ladderman-Ukelis, who is an artist from 1960, wrote a book. It's really a title of an exhibition. It's a manifesto for in here. I'll maybe read 303. So absolutely, yes, there should be. That's the idea, the hope that people will start doing the thinking themselves. But so she writes a manifesto for maintenance art, 1969. And I just love it because there is, I want to read from it. I mean, this is like the best theory ever, right? 1, ideas. A, the death instinct and the life instinct. The death instinct, separation, individuality, avant-garde par excellence, to follow one's own path to death. Do your own thing, dynamic change. The life instinct, unification, the eternal return, the perpetuation in capital letters, maintenance of the species, survival systems, operations, equilibrium. She is trying to take this idea of maintenance and she says, maintenance, it's a drag. It takes all the fucking time. Literally, the mind boggles and chafes at the boredom. The culture confers lousy status on maintenance jobs, equal minimum wages, housewives, equal no pay. Guess what? She's a feminist. She's saying, I have to raise my children and I have to work and my husband just gets to watch TV. And so he's telling me maybe I should stop working because I need to raise the children. No, I don't think so. You know, I'm going to keep working. Not only that, I'm going to make the care that I spend taking care of my children and taking care of the world into art. And she says, she turns it upside down and she says, you know what, that's the kind of work we need is a work that cares. That should be what has the least value, should have the most value. That's her feminist manifesto, right? And so that is so important because here we are, that was 1969, here we are 2022 thinking we got to take care of the world. Who's going to take care of the world? How are we going to pay for it? How much is it going to cost? So there she was thinking about it from a very personal life experience. So I hope that students, you guys, you know, are going to start to not try to say, oh, what are people doing, but trying to see what is being done, what's happening, and try to theorize that, as she did as well, right? So there's a lot of influential intersections here, in this case with feminism and with other schools that in my view are core to preservation. But Ukelis has never been included in a preservation theory anthology. You know, just it didn't seem like, you know, and you ask her and she's not going to say I'm a preservationist. She's not going to say, you know, but does she need to for us to pay attention? You know, does that kind of address your question, Skylar? But I think the more important thing, so the more pragmatic thing, look, these are readings for class. So I hope that teachers will adopt this as their textbook, will, as not the, you know, the only textbook, but like the first place, an easy reference, a resource. It's very hard to be a teacher. You know, there's not a lot of time to prepare your syllabus. You got to go find the text. You have to educate yourself. Sometimes, you know, these young teachers, they're being told to teach historic preservation theory because nobody else wants to teach it, because it's the boring subject, right? Everybody wants to teach architectural theory because that's cool, but nobody wants to teach preservation theory because nobody knows a damn thing about it. So they give it to the young people who have to do the heavy lifting and the hard work. And I kept meeting those young professors who were saying, help me out, can you give me a hand? What should I give my students to read? And so I really didn't want to do this book, but I remember one time we were in a car with a colleague in Texas, and I said, I just, you know, I'm done. I really don't, I don't want to, it's a drag, right? It's like, and they're like, you have a responsibility to do it. You have to, you know, you have to do it, put it out there and let other people do other similar ones. So, okay, just push a little bit and put it out there. And there was also an excuse to talk to those professors, to those young professors who wanted the text, to say, what do you think should be in the book? You know, what should we put in? Oh, you think, you know, so-and-so, oh, that's interesting. You speak German. You want to translate it? You know? So that was a fun conversation. Are there things that from the online crew that we need to
raise hands? So maybe...
I want to get to the 2 for 1. I want to get to the 2.
There was Luca Basso, the one that raised the hand. So I asked to activate the audio.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Hi, Luca.
Wait, I turn on the volume.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, I have a question. The question is about the difference between theory and a dogma. You said about the dogma, it is not a dogma, so we can have a discussion about the preservation in a discipline with a research from each one. But in truth, we can just interpret it what we can't change. I mean, the facts can be dogmatic because the facts is what is happened, and next this thing we can discuss about it. For example, we can interpret the woman who wants her independence from the husband, but she can't do 2 things together. She can't have a cure for their children and even work for herself. So you can't, you can discuss about in a theory about the politic, about feminism, but you can't change the drama about the woman. feminism because she wants her independence, but it's like a compromise because she can't have it if she wants her liberty. She can't afford children because she become dependent of their children. So
what's the question, Luca? Because I'm not quite following.
The question is, the theory can only afford a kind of political questions, or it's only about the history in the facts?
Maybe your question has to do with the relationship between theory and practice.
Yes, a kind of this.
Yeah. So this is discussed in the introduction, and I encourage you to look at that. And we were talking about this earlier today. So that theory and practice are obviously related. They are not the same. They are in kind of dialectical relationship. Some so-called theories completely ignore practice. Some practices completely ignore any kind of intellectual pretense. In this book, I've been more interested in the relation where practice becomes informed by theory and theory becomes informed by practice. And so I think that, the word for that would be praxis, Praxis, a theoretically informed practice, a practice that is acknowledging its thinking and that is enacting its own thinking. So the same goes for theory, right? A theory that is conscious of its practice, what kind of practice it is. We can talk more about that later, but I think that's probably all that I would say at the moment. All of these texts are deeply engaged in a relationship with practice as well. To the point Mirele Lader-Manoukilis was talking and theorizing her practice as a maintenance worker and as a caregiver, and turning that into a kind of structure of thought. Maybe I'll pause there. How's everyone feeling? Do we need to take a break? This took a lot longer than I thought. By the way, this is the world premiere of this book. This is, ta-da, we are in Venice. This is the first time I present the book, so thank you. Do we need to take a break? Do we need to get up, or should we jump right into phase two? Break?
Yes, it is interesting about the emancipation of women, but it is not my idea. My idea was just to understand this difference between theory and dogma.
Right. About. Why don't you write me an email and we can continue the conversation about that? I'm mindful of the time and I want to get on to the next part of the presentation.
It can be a good idea.
Okay, super. This thing is stopped going forward.
Should we make like 5 minutes pause?
Yeah, a little, like 2-3 minutes, 5 minutes, go stretch your legs. Thank you. We can.
So we see you in like 3 minutes or something like that. Thank you.
All right, so this is the United States Embassy in Oslo. It was built in 1959. It was designed by Eero Saarinen, one of the major modernist architects. An embassy is actually the people that are sent by a country to another country. Where they go and where they work, the office building where they work is called a chancery. Chancery is a word in English that derives from the Latin word cancellus, which means fence, gate, chancel. It is also included in religious buildings and all sorts of political buildings. It's about what's in and what's out. The chancellor is the gatekeeper, the person that decides when the gate gets opened and when it is closed. The gatekeeper decides what goes in, what goes out, what messages are acceptable, what messages are not acceptable. Chancery has everything to do with gates and fences. And this building, for a good third of its life, had a fence in front of it. But it was a fence. So it's a fence upon a fence. We've been talking about temples upon temples. So this building was sold by the United States recently, and it was bought by a private developer. And in the process, it was turned into a monument. The local landmarks commission, the National Landmarks Commission of Norway, designated it a monument, said this is a national monument. And where does this monument end? Very carefully, they drew the line on this side of that fence, such that the fence that was put up by the United States was not considered part of the monument. This part does not belong. So the gate, the chancel, was divided in half. And this whole thing, we lost the image. Oh, came back. This whole thing was to be thrown away, to the garbage. Next. So this is the plan. It's a triangular plan. Here is the perimeter fence. Let's go to the next. We're trying to save time here. Is that the button? I can just hit that button, and then we can share.
I was just worried that maybe on Zoom they could see this screen, and so.
Oh, is everything okay?
I'm asking to people.
Okay. Here you can see the triangle of the embassy. There you can see the chancery around it. We'll have the next.
No.
Qui non vediamo nulla.
Okay.
La condivisione dello schermo in pausa. Maybe if you click on it over here, it'll be the fence was meant to be thrown into the garbage. So I had a discussion with the national preservation officers, architects, etc., about the need to preserve this fence as part of what the value of this building, about the meaning of this building, about the historical meaning of this building, as this is an important layer in the history of the embassy. I didn't get very far. I was told,
now there is the sharing video.
About the building, it should be the fence should be. So I began to think about a way in which I could use art to give a new life to this fence that could preserve it. So how art can be a way to preserve those elements that are not considered necessarily significant or important by the official rules and regulations that happen to be in place, right? So how can we then use art as a way to preserve these materials that will enable a dialogue and a continued dialogue between the building and this material over time. So Norway is, of course, a very important building for the United States because it shares a border with Russia, and Russia, of course, was the Soviet Union. Next. And so geopolitically, it's been very important for the United States and for the North Atlantic Treaty. When Norway decided to join, or it was being debated whether Norway should be joining NATO, there was a lot of protests in Norway that happened in front of the United States Embassy, because the United States, of course, is one of the strongest members of NATO, because the worry was that if Norway joined NATO, this would provoke Russia into attacking Norway to protect it from being part of the capitalist world. And so many people were very afraid, and many people protested in front. And so this gate became also a gate that was understood by these people as one cancello through which messages would go into the embassy, right? The facade, the gate is a message. Please, next. This is a view of it without a protest, in which other messages are being conveyed from the inside out as well. about stability, about openness. So the architecture is also communicating. Next. So in order to preserve the fence, I started a performance in front of the fence where I rented a bunch of caterpillars and I made them dance in front of the building, and in their dance remove the fence, but remove it in a way that would give it movement, that would give it a kind of relationship of directionality towards the building. The next one should be a video, actually, and hopefully it plays.
Yes.
Okay, great. So it looks like it's a little bit. So now, what shape to give it? What should be the actual shape? This was something that for me was a question rather than something to be answered, but it was something that came out of the very process of removing the fence. So I wanted the history, the kind of process, the technique of the removal to be inscribed into the actual material. It was important to me not to simply just try to act as if this fence was a perfect kind of piece of design, which it was not. It was a standard military fence, heavy duty, blast proof, but to really account for the way in which this was for that performance, for that movement, and to actually begin to take a plane and to begin to turn it, to begin to extend it from one place to another. And of course, this became a series of fragments. Now the fragments are mobile, they're left, they've moved, they are no longer in the building. There are pieces of the fragments that are straight, but some other pieces of the fragment that have begun to move. And so I began to put them together to organize them into a series of sculptures that could then be fragments of the building that could start to walk, that could start to travel. So the building becomes mobile as a kind of walking cities, you know, if you know that reference of Archigram. In that walking, they also take a history with them, but they're always related back to the place where they came from. So they always have that relationship. So let's go to the next. So
can I ask you to come a bit closer for the audio and?
Well, of course, yes. So can you hear me better over here? Maybe, yeah.
Yes.
So here's a piece that traveled to London. This was exhibited in Regent's Park in London as part of free sculpture. And the piece is called Biosignature Preservation. So biosignature preservation, where does that come from? It is a message that went through the fence. I read all of the treaties that were signed between the United States and Norway and took pieces of these treaties, these bits of knowledge that moved through, to begin to understand those messages that went through as a kind of long wedge of the future, because these treaties were about what we're going to do in the future. And so biosignature preservation is a treaty that was signed between the United States and Norway to explore how to determine whether there was biological life on Mars. Biology, as you know, if you've ever looked at a piece of limestone, what does it have trapped inside the lime? Shells. It has little animals trapped in there. So biosignature is those shells, and what preserves it is the fact that it's trapped inside of stone. So that's what this was about. How do we get instrumentation to Mars that will be able to look at stone and be able to figure out if there are any bacteria, any shellfish, anything contained in that stone that would suggest that there had ever been life on Mars? That means we're going to Mars, right? That means that, let's go next, please. Polar Partnership has to do with the colonization of the North Pole, a process that began in the 19th century, where the United States was colonizing the West, imposing a new system of government on native peoples. The same happened in the north of Europe, where the colonization of the northern peoples, the First Nations, we saw some of that at the so-called Scandinavian Pavilion, which is now called the Sami Pavilion, right? The Sami peoples. Colonization, why? Because they had mineral deposits, they brought trains to mine those cities. as the polar region melts, we know that there are mineral deposits under the ocean. Who owns those? This was a treaty to create a partnership among friends in the North Pole to take over parts of the North Pole. This hasn't happened yet, but this is a sculpture that bears a message that is telling us about a future in which we're going to be fighting over who gets to mine in the North Pole. Let's go to the next. This one is airworthiness. This one is a treaty to develop a spaceship to travel to Mars, which your great-grandchildren will travel in. Of course, we will not be using normal fuel. We're going to be sailing like Columbus sailed on the ships. Columbus used earth winds. This ship will be using solar winds. And it is a whole multi-million-dollar research project to figure out how do you create winds that travel on solar wind. Next. This one's called analog sites. Very important for you because as architects, we're constantly thinking about analog sites. Oh, this is like that. I cannot get to the Teatro Verde in Venice, so let me go look at the open Shakespeare Theater in Central Park and try to figure that out. Analog sites, we owe the idea of analogical architecture to Rossi, the Italian school of urban morphology. That thinking here, analog sites, is we're going to Mars. How are we going to build cities in Mars? Let's use some sites on Earth as analogous sites to the north. So the island of Svalbard in near the North Pole, and Hawaii, out of all places, are the two analogous sites that Norway and the United States are exploring as places in which we are experimenting for how to colonize Mars. And let's go to the next. Byproduct material. Anytime you colonize, anytime you do anything, anytime you inhabit somewhere, you're going to create byproduct material, from organic debris to the product of building, some things. What do you do with it? Scarce resources in Mars. So how do you use the stuff that you are going to be using up and reusing it into a new kind of product? Very interesting, because this is also in a byproduct material, both of the process of architecture and the process of preservation, and this idea that a material is not just architecture when it is stuck on top of other materials on a building site, but that even as it's removed from that site, even as it travels, even as it becomes a fragment that is loose from its original site, it can still be architecture. It can still be part of that architecture. So byproduct material really challenges our idea that architecture is what we design to be assembled on top of a place, but it asks us to take into consideration where that material came from and where it's going afterwards, because it is part of a continuum of a process in which it is entangled with all sorts of social, political projects along the way. I'll have the next. Some smaller pieces that are part of this project, exploring different kind of relationships. This one over here in the foreground, you only see a part of it, which has a straight piece at the top, is called Holders of Traditional Knowledge. It is a treaty that was signed between the United States and Norway to make sure to have dialogue with the Sami people when you are putting up research stations on their land, where to put the research station and how to understand that process. So all of these sculptures are each both talking about where they came from, but they're certainly they're going to a different place. They're coming from one place and going to a different place. And in the process, they're opening up a view of where they're going, but they're not there yet. So they are, the sculpture is also its title. So it's both the textual and the material in dialogue with each other. We'll have the next one. Here's another project in which I played with this concept of fragments, of pieces. This is a very typical way of dealing with architectural fragments where they cannot be put back to the building where they came from because maybe that building is lost, it's no longer there. So in Italy, there is this great tradition of taking those fragments and then bringing them together to present the semblance of a whole. And that whole, and here I'm looking at Mark because I have to thank Mark for making me think and referencing and introducing me to a particular work by Lawrence Weiner that has that title, that has the title.
Bits and pieces.
Brought together
to present a semblance of a whole.
To present the semblance of the whole. Bits and pieces brought together to present the semblance of the whole. What's the whole? Well, the whole is the ancient world. You know, these are projects to try to present a view of history, to try to take bits and pieces of evidence from the past and try to reconstruct what might have been. This is at the heart of what we do as preservationists. We take bits and pieces and bring them together to present the semblance of a whole. We also need to call into question the very semblance of the whole that we are presenting, right? Because it is in that way that we are also making visible our methodology. And so how big does a fragment need to be meaningful, to be important? What I tried to do here, and this is now a permanent, a long-term, not permanent, because nothing's permanent, but it's a long-term installation where I cleaned this wall of the American Academy and left the dark. This is actually looks a lot more sharp than it actually is. I think there's something about it, that's fine. It allows you to see it a little bit better. You see this bikini line over here? You know, the dark part at the top, that's the dust on the wall. And then below it, this section has been, the dust has been removed with a latex cleaning technique that I'll tell you a little bit more about in a second. Here you have the latex cast, where all the dust that was once here is now here and has been removed. But this is one cast, actually, but I decided to frame it partly because many dialogues that Mark and I have had over the years where the frame is actually a frame that slips over and becomes another frame. So it's a frame that's reframed. It's one piece in the back. So it's an exploration of this idea that these fragments are very intentionally cutting some of these fragments, but the fragments continue behind as a way to also question the fact that this is what's important here is not each of the individual fragments, but it's the dust that's in it. So because dust to me is one of those fragments, it comes off of buildings. And so this piece is called, it's a little bit of a long title, but I kind of like it. You know, it's called Therefore by Bodies Unseen, Does Nature Do Its Work? That is a line from Lucretius. Lucretius was a scientist of the ancient world, and we owe to Lucretius the first deep observations of dust. And from those, he sat there and just, you know, spent long hours looking at dust floating in the air. And he also looked at statues, and he looked at the way that people in their ritual touching of statues wore the statues down. And he said, how come that material is becoming smaller and smaller every time? I don't see any evidence of any dust. People, when they look at their hand, there's nothing on it. He didn't have a microscope. What's going on? He said, he theorized there must be some pieces of the building that are coming off that I cannot see. There must be bodies unseen. And those bodies unseen must be the way, the basic units of nature, the basic units of physics, the atom, we call it today, right? And so he began to theorize through the observation of the decay of buildings, something that every preservationist is trained to do. Not to simply say, oh, there's decay, but to wonder about the nature of existence. And that's what I think we should be doing as preservationists, right? Not to just say there is decay, but to wonder about the nature of existence today. And so what kind of work does our work do today? What is at work in the work? As Palladio told us in his Teatro Olimpico, right? This work is doing the work, right? So let's have the next, please. And so this is the whole, so here what no?
Go back.
Oh.
What? Go back.
No, it's,
There we go.
this, the color here is a little bit off, but it doesn't matter. These are different pieces of dust from the American Academy in Rome brought together to present the semblance of a whole. This is a different kind of whole than the building that was built by McKimmett and White that we call the American Academy in Rome. But it is a kind of whole where pieces are slipping into one another, where, you know, it is not clear whether this piece continues, whether that piece continues in its one piece or multiple pieces. That was the thinking that went behind this. Is the first time I do this, so I'm experimenting with it, very much like you guys are experimenting with your own designs, okay? But this notion that through pieces, and of course the wall becomes part of the piece. The wall becomes a way to bring the pieces together. The space between them becomes very operative, very important. But what is being brought together is all this dust. Of course, where does the dust come from? What is the whole that is being represented? What I've been after is this notion that, of course, this dust doesn't just come from the building. It's not what the building leaves off, but it's also what the atmosphere drops in. So there is this mix that happens at the surface between architecture and environment that makes architecture a kind of a nexus, a place, a hotspot for environmental and architectural enactments of various kinds. I don't know which one's which. Now, what happens when you remove that dust from the building? So what happens when you take a fragment from a building and it starts to move around and move to other places? So this is a whole question for me. It's Francesca would say, you know, we were asking Francesca questions. She said, that is a serious question. And then she said, the answer is this. And sometimes she said, that is a real question. And they had no answer. The real questions had no answer. What is a distributed monument? What does it do? What happens when that fragment begins to move? I'm interested to know, and to dialogue with you all, is it a real question or is it a serious question? What is being revealed through the process? Robert Smithson, who was a very important artist of the 1960s for me, developed the idea of site and non-site, in which he said, sometimes you take a piece of stone from a landscape and you move it into an art gallery. And in that process, you are describing that landscape that was not described, did not have meaning, artistic meaning, social, perhaps cultural meaning. Now you are creating it through that movement between site and non-site. That to me was a really interesting revelation of what's happening in terms of this process, where it's coming to and where it's going from. And it actually came because of this project over here, which was, this is actually a piece of one of my pieces. This is a section, a fragment of one of my artworks, which I did not decide to cut. We'll have the next. This is in a museum up in the north of this is the actual work. This is the work. This is a work of 6 years of collaboration between the British Parliament to clean all the dust of Westminster Hall. This building for me was very important to clean because I saw it in relationship to the Doge's Palace. And the Doge's Palace I had been fortunate enough to be able to work on, thanks to our dear friend Ilaria Cavagioni, who really supervised that whole process, and together with Renata Godello a long time ago, gave me the green light to remove the dust that was left on the Doge's Palace. And this Doge's Palace and this 1,000-year-old building, which is Westminster Hall, was tied together in the mind of a very important person for me, John Ruskin, who's one of the first really substantial thinkers of historic preservation. And so just to say, the piece you saw before is a cut of this, was sectioned, was divided, it was distributed. Why? Because when we opened the show, we had no idea, nobody knew, it was supposed to be a quiet summer. It was the same week as the Brexit vote. And so here we are exhibiting 1,000 years of dust of Parliament, and meanwhile, the whole of the British reality, the political reality is coming apart. And Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson are walking through this hall, being chased by journalists. Boris Johnson goes behind there to take a phone call with security guards to either side to kind of hide behind the dust, to take some phone calls to figure out what did we do. The piece became associated with this kind of moment, and so the question was, where should the piece live? Should it go to one single museum? And the decision was made, not by me, but by all of the partners and stakeholders that were part of this process, to divide it and to donate it to all of the national museums of all of the nations of the United Kingdom. Northern Ireland got a piece. Scotland, Wales, England, all got pieces. Canada requested a piece and was not given a piece because it was considered that this should stay in the UK. So the piece not only left the wall, in which it was intention as an ephemeral proposition, but it now began to travel to all these different museums. So let's go to the next.
But sorry to interrupt you. Was it out of question to remain in Westminster?
Yes, completely out of the question.
Okay.
Yeah. This was the first time that a work of a contemporary art was exhibited in that space, and so it was definitely temporary. It was very political, intense to be able to actually even show it for 3 months. This was up for 3 months. This is Westminster Hall. This is the 1,000-year-old building. It has been in the British government as a seat of government, as a working government building for 1,000 years. It used to be a hall, a banquet hall. It was the royal courts. It's now the entrance to the House of Lords and the House of Commons. We know it because of this edition of the 19th century, but we have this edition because all of this burnt down. Let's go to the next. And of course, now we're familiar with this. I'll show you the fire in a second. Also because this is where the royalty lies in state. So this is Queen Elizabeth II being taken here next, where this is her coffin. This is where she lied in state. This is the wall that we cleaned. This is the wall that we removed the dust. Now, of course, that is a place that has these associations to really important, political, powerful figures. And their stories are told in various ways inside this building through plaques. There will be a plaque here that says Queen Elizabeth II lied in state here. What stories are told through these small fragments that we call dust? So can we go to the next? I was interested in that. Here is the previous monarch, and look at the wall, how dirty it is over here. That's the dust that was removed. What was in that dust? Can we go to the next? This is the view of the dust translated 4 meters in front of the wall. Go to the next. Well, there's a whole series of events, of course, that's in the dust. This is the trial of Charles I, the first monarch to be put to death by his own government. Can you believe it? Isn't the monarch supposed to be the government? Charles I said, hey, everybody, we're moving too slow over here. Our government is not modern enough. The guys that have a modern government, they're the French. They have an absolute monarchy. This parliamentary thing is not working out. We need to make decisions a lot faster. So let me start a absolute monarchy and get rid of parliament. Parliament said, not so fast. They apprehended him, tried him, and killed him. So the first regicide. Now we kill the president every 4 years. But we wouldn't be doing that if it wasn't for this idea of that happened here, of that the law applies to everyone. Let's go next. 1649, that's roughly when does San Giorgio get built?
Starts in the 50s and finishes in 1610. But in the I'm sorry, 1560s. It doesn't actually, I mean, the initial designs, or let's say late 1560s, and then construction in the 70s, Palladio dies in 1580, and then 30 years later.
So it's 1620s, this is getting built. So just around the same time. Okay, here's those plaques, wherever all that history gets recorded. Let's go to the next. So I was interested in removing this dust. This is our scaffolding to remove the dust. Go to the next. Here's a piece of what this is with dust, this is without dust. Let's go to the next. This is, we're going to skip this movie. Go to the next. Maybe go to the next.
Trying to.
Oh, it might be trying to start a movie. Okay. The fire. So all those particles that had no archival evidence of the building having been built after the fire. They were trying to save this incredible 1400s hammer beam oak roof. Go to the next. But also all of this pollution that was in the air, you know, the UK was one of the first to industrialize in the world. Next. And here is the 1950s, 1952. This is the same year as the burial of lying in the state of George. People, next, of breathing in all this stuff, but also the history of very amazing preservation projects. This is the fumigation preservation project. So preservation carried out through particulate volatile matter. What are they trying to do? They're trying to kill the beetle that is in the ceiling, the oak beams above, which was eating away at the beams, and they were worried that the beams were going to collapse. In fact, the beams are like these beams. They're no longer, the wood's not really structural. It is all steel holding it up. So these are all preservationists, just like you, turning on the fumigation cans. All of those DDT, all of that was in the walls. So there's a history that is environmental, that is about our relationship to other animals, our relationship to architecture, how we think of care. Next, of course, by the way, it's called the Death Watch beetle. That's not its official name, Latin name, but because it looks down on the dead kings and queens. And so here you have the final project. So I'm very interested in that collective history that is told through the dust, because that collective history is the product of our collective existence. It's the product of our collective work, but it's also the unintentional product. It's the byproduct material. The stuff that we put in the air, we put because we don't know how to not put it. If we want to make this computer or get over here, we need to make all of this pollution. So all of that pollution is going way up into the sky, and it's really redesigning the world's atmosphere. We know that, that's a simple, right? Greenhouse gases, all of these questions that we keep discussing, they're not abstract, they're material that we created, that we pumped into the air. So we are actually creating a monument. We're creating this global object that we call the atmosphere, which is a man-made object. And that has registers, different fragments of it that deposit on these long pieces of stone and buildings that stay for a very long time, and that I think of as environmental sensors. These buildings are sensing this deposits of the atmosphere and we can collect, but we don't see it. And there's that dust all around. Look at that window behind you. Look at the dust in that window. We don't typically look out of a window and consider the dust unless the light hits it that way, right? So illumination is a very big part of seeing. That's how Lucretius saw dust as well, right? That's how we also see the dust in the atmospheres, because the sun hits it and it creates certain kinds of hazes. So visibility, the very act of looking, is changed by this dust in the air. So part of these works, and maybe, I don't know if there's another one, but I'm going to stop because it's too much. There, let's go to the next one. All of this dust is being created by all this architecture. Let's go to the next. Can we really say that architecture stops at the lot line when we have to make all this? Look at this dust, look at the atmosphere over here. It was middle of the day. It looks like nighttime because there's so much dust in the air. Next. Of course, tremendous health effects. Let's go to the next. We remove it. This is the beginning of preservation as a business, you know, is the cleaning of facades. Next. This is something like what I did in Venice, in what I did in Rome. Next. So I think here's a work that I did in a copy of Trajan's Column in London. It's a work that was done of a monument in Rome that is a first century monument that by the 1860s already preservation was saying this is being affected by pollution and we need to preserve it. And what do we do to preserve it? Let's make a plaster copy. Plaster copy is what some of them go to London. It's installed in London in the museum. Where do they put it? It's around a chimney. Around a chimney, the very idea, the very symbol of pollution. What's happening in 1870? We have the material inside of this chimney because the museum had open windows and all the dust from the outside world was going in and they never went inside the chimney. So all the dust was collected inside. And here, look at this painting by James Webb. When you look at it over at the top, if you can see it, the sky looks clear. It looks like it's just clear sky, right? But if you focus into that area, every building is smoking. Every building is smoking, and you can see the pain and the care that the artist has taken to depict the dust in the air, the visibility, the change between the kind of pale white to reddish tint, moving all the way to blue. And John Ruskin said, we used to think that there was clear sky above the dome of pollution that is in London, but as of 1876, he declared, there is no more pure weather above London smoke. In other words, we've not only polluted low, we polluted high, and he did that just by looking. He just kept looking at the clouds. So every morning when he got up, he painted a cloud. And over the course of his life, he saw how clouds had changed color and hue and began to speculate, just like Lucretius, about this monument that we call the atmosphere, that for me is a cultural monument. So how do we care? How do we maintain the atmosphere? That is a question that these works begin to raise. Let's go to the next, but don't necessarily answer. What I would say the first thing is I'm going to skip over this next. The first thing we need to do is to begin to visualize. Let's go to the next. We need to visualize this pollution. So let's go. This is the materiality of the latex. Let's go to the next. Okay, so here you have, this is the column, half the column, that's the other half. It was too big to fit inside the building, so they split it in half. So this interior I cast and put next to it. So what you're looking at here is the interior dust of this building over here. This room is a poor man's grand tour of Europe. You're very fortunate and privileged to actually take the real grand tour. You're here. You're where the rich people used to come to when they had a lot of money. Actually, you have a lot of resources. Not many students get to come to Venice. Here you are. If you couldn't take the trip, you could go to the museum and go see all of the monuments of European culture in one room in high definition plaster casts. That was a way of educating the working class, which was very important in the 19th century for Prince Albert and Queen Victoria. This is a view of civilization, of Western culture, that does not incorporate dust. So for me, it was very important to, in that room, say the grand tour includes dust, includes the products, the byproducts of making culture. So how do we now begin to relate, right? So to motivate 1 column, 2 column, 3 column, how do we go from 1 to 3? And that, what is that transition like? What happens in that process? Let's go to the next. So here's another view of it. Go to the next. And of course, if you see it, if you look for pollution, I'm not going to show you this project, but if you look for pollution, you see it everywhere. This is Art History 101. So as pointillism, the invention of a different, if you've ever painted, you use the paint this way, you spread it on the canvas. So I says that's not what it looks like. That's not what air looks like. Air looks like dust. So he starts painting with paint stains. And that begins to create a very interesting dissolution of form, because the edge of the figure and the edge of the river begin to mesh into one another. The dots in one place are connected to the dots in another. We know that it's a Sunday because the factories, you can't see them because you're too far, but there are chimneys over here. The factories are not smoking except for one. And the air is a little bit cleaner because it's Sunday, so they're relaxing and they're hanging out. I looked at this painting again when I was doing a project for Louis Vuitton. Let's just very quickly end on that. That was Louis Vuitton's factory. That's where he was making all the famous bags. And this is his house, this is his factory, this is his window, this is the street where all the materials came in. This is where the bags went out. This is now part of LVMH. This is where they have the big celebrations. If you want to commission yourself a one-of-a-kind bag, this is where it's made. If you just get one of the few $1,000 bags, that's in the stores. I wanted to clean this building because all the dust that came out of that factory landed on this building. But of course, when it was bought by LVMH, the first thing they did was to clean it. But if you look, right, as a preservationist, we look, this brick is a little bit darker than that brick. I'm like, why is that a little bit darker? Can we go in there? They had added this in the 1990s to make a garbage room, to put the garbage bucket. So let's go to the next. In that garbage room, we found the original pollution that Seurat was painting with. He was representing. Here is the actual pollution. And so this is the entrance to their new museum. The first thing that you would see would be the pollution that the factory made. And then to the left, the actual bags that came out of that. And this is a portrait of Mr. Louis Vuitton. So very daring curatorial decision to show what Marx would call the constitutive externality as part of the actual work. So I'm going to stop there. There's so much else to talk about, so many other projects to discuss, but I think here at least you can see the relationship between all of these pieces, bits and pieces, and how in bringing them together, they raise the question of what is the whole, and how that whole also raises other questions about how do we take care of it. You know, once we begin to visualize the air as a monument, then how do we then begin to address it, design it, consciously maintain it, engage in the environmental questions that it raises. I will pause there because it's for 1600. So thank you very much. You're very nice. You had no choice. Jordan.
You can still see those pieces on display directly.
Some yes, some no. Some yes, some no. Yeah, depends on where they are. Yes.
On the chancery, I'm curious about your choice to not paint the metal after you've deconstructed it, especially the pieces that will be displayed outside. Do you anticipate that those will continue to rust and degrade, or will someone come through and paint them?
Well, so the pieces are actually steel, but they're hot dip galvanized. And you know, because you went to the hot dip galvanizing plant outside of New York City, that galvanization is self-healing to some extent. So some of the cuts and bruises, the galvanic action will leap over, and some of it will, you know, but I was very interested in, they show the galvanic, you know, coating is very shiny and it's under this very gray stuff. So I was interested in how it reveals the layers of paint. But, you know, these sculptures get maintained different ways. There is some cold galvanizing spray that you can put in to maintain different bits and pieces, but I think the actual, most of it will be in very good shape. Okay, well, maybe we'll stop there. I'm afraid we don't really have time for questions because we have an appointment in half an hour. Unless there's something very, very quick, but yeah.
I don't read the question written already. So maybe the invitation that you made to the other students to write an email to maybe to us, info.aoa@cini.it, and maybe I can forward it to the professor if.
I think that's better, just because I'm sorry, but you know, we need to go visit a building.
Sure, because they are still on this trip, on this workshop. And
yeah, we're
summer school
on the
trip.
We're walking.
So thank you very much.
Thank you to all of you that joined on.
I hope so. Thank you to you, teacher. Thank you very much.
Yes. Enjoy your weekend.
You too.
Today you raised some questions that is for who was here yesterday as well, on Zoom, of course. Also yesterday, from a very different point of view, we spoke about the slippery border between what is visible, what is not, and what is necessary to show of what is not clearly visible usually. So thank you very much.
Great, super. Thank you. All right.